It was a place where the line between right and wrong blurred like the horizon at dusk, where men and women carved out their lives with grit, steel, and the occasional prayer. Justice was a fragile thing, carried on the shoulders of those brave enough or foolish enough to wear a badge. And in the Wyoming territory, where the wind whispered through the sagebrush and the mountains loomed like silent sentinels, justice was a rare and precious commodity. Marshal Elias Grey knew this better than most. He had spent years chasing outlaws across the plains, burying friends and enemies alike in the hard, unforgiving soil. He wasn't a man of speeches or grand ideals. He was a man of action, a man who believed in doing what was right, even when it cost him everything. But when word reached him that Walker Wiley, the most dangerous outlaw in the territory, had resurfaced, Elias knew this wasn't just another job. This was personal. Walker Wiley was no ordinary criminal. He was a man who thrived on chaos, a cunning predator who left a trail of destruction wherever he went. His gang was ruthless, his reputation legendary, and his motives as unpredictable as the prairie winds. But Walker wasn't just after money or power. He was after something deeper, something that gnawed at Elias's gut like a bad omen. Elias wasn't alone in his fight. By his side rode a team of misfits and survivors, each with their own scars and secrets. Annie McGraw, the fiery sharpshooter with a laugh as sharp as her aim. Maria Vega, the former Pinkerton agent whose calm intellect masked a past she rarely spoke of. Caleb Boone, the grizzled tracker who could read the land like a book. And Doc Harlan, the dry-witted gunslinger who had seen more bloodshed than most men could stomach. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with, bound by loyalty and a shared sense of purpose. But the hunt for Walker Wiley would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. It would take them across the harsh Wyoming landscape, through gunfights and ambushes, and into the depths of their own fears and desires. It would force them to confront not only the outlaw they pursued, but also the shadows within themselves. This is a story of justice and vengeance, of loyalty and betrayal, of love and loss. It is a story of the West in all its raw, untamed glory. And as the sun sets over the plains and the shadows grow long, one thing is certain. Not everyone will make it out alive. The law and the outlaw are on a collision course, and when they meet, the West will never be the same. Chapter 1. Shadows on the Horizon. The sun was sinking low over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in streaks of amber and crimson. The air was heavy with the scent of sagebrush and dust, and the faint sound of cicadas hummed in the distance. Marshal Elias Grey sat astride his chestnut mare, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. He was a man of few words, his face weathered by years of chasing outlaws and burying friends. Tonight, though, his thoughts were elsewhere, on the town of Redstone, where trouble was brewing like a storm on the prairie. Behind him, his team rode in a loose formation, their silhouettes framed by the dying light. Annie McGraw, the auburn-haired sharpshooter, rode with her rifle slung across her back, her green eyes sharp and restless. She was a firebrand, quick to laugh and quicker to fight, but there was a quiet tension in her tonight. Beside her, Maria Vega, the brown-haired former Pinkerton agent, rode with a calm, measured grace. Maria was the thinker of the group, her mind always working 2 steps ahead, though her past was a mystery she rarely shared. The 2 men brought up the rear. Caleb Boone, the grizzled tracker, had a face like the land he read so well, scarred, rugged, and unyielding. He was a man of the earth, his connection to the wilderness almost uncanny. Doc Harlan, the fastest of the group, was a former bounty hunter with a dry wit and a steady hand. He had seen more than his share of bloodshed, but his loyalty to Elias and the badge was unshakable. Elias pulled his horse to a stop at the crest of a hill, the town of Redstone sprawling out below. It was a small place, little more than a cluster of wooden buildings and a single dirt road cutting through the center. But it was home to good people, and that was enough for Elias. He had sworn to protect them, no matter the cost. "Walker's gang is here," Elias said, his voice low but firm. "Wiley's been quiet for months, but word is they've been hitting ranches south of here. Now they're bold enough to come into town." Annie tightened her grip on the reins, her jaw set. "Walker's a fool if he thinks he can waltz into Redstone and take what he wants." "Fool or not, he's dangerous," Maria said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "We've seen what he's capable of." Elias nodded. Walker Wiley was no ordinary outlaw. He was a man who thrived on chaos, his gang leaving a trail of destruction wherever they went. But there was something more to Walker, something that gnawed at Elias's gut. The man wasn't just after money or power. He was after something personal. "We'll split up," Elias said. "Annie, Maria, you take the east side of town. Caleb, Doc, you're with me. Keep your eyes open and your guns ready. Walker's not the type to play fair." The group nodded, their faces grim. They had been through enough together to know what was at stake. As they rode into town, the tension in the air was palpable. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual bustle of townsfolk replaced by shuttered windows and locked doors. Redstone was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Annie and Maria dismounted near the general store, their boots kicking up small clouds of dust as they hit the ground. Annie adjusted her rifle, her eyes scanning the shadows. "You think Walker's here already?" she asked, her voice low. Maria nodded toward the saloon, where a faint light flickered behind the curtains. "If he's not, his men are. That's where we'll find them." Annie hesitated, her gaze lingering on Maria. There was something about the way that she carried herself, a quiet strength that Annie couldn't help but admire. She shook the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. There was no time for distractions, not now. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with the smell of whiskey and sweat. A handful of men sat at the bar, their eyes darting toward the door as Annie and Maria entered. The room fell silent, the tension crackling like a live wire. "We're looking for Walker Wiley," Maria said, her voice steady. "Anyone here care to point us in the right direction?" The men exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Annie stepped forward, her rifle resting casually in her hands. "We can do this the easy way," she said, her tone light but dangerous. "Or the hard way. Your choice." Before anyone could answer, the sound of boots on wood echoed from the back of the saloon. A tall man stepped into the light, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He moved with the confidence of someone who had nothing to fear, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "Ladies," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "I believe you're looking for me." Annie's grip tightened on her rifle, her heart pounding in her chest. This was Walker Wiley, the man who had haunted their trail for months. But as his eyes met hers, a flicker of something unexpected passed between them. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a predator. Maria stepped forward, her hand hovering near her own gun. "You've got two choices, Walker," she said. "Surrender now, or face the consequences." Walker chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. "I've never been one for surrender," he said. "But I'll tell you what, I'll give you a head start. Run back to your marshal. Tell him I'm coming for him. And when I do, there won't be a town left to save." The room erupted into chaos as Walker's men drew their guns, the crack of gunfire shattering the tense silence. Annie and Maria dove for cover, their own weapons blazing as they fought to hold their ground. Outside, Elias and the others heard the commotion and spurred their horses into a gallop, their hearts racing as they charged toward the saloon. The battle for Redstone had begun, and none of them would emerge unscathed. But in the midst of the chaos, as bullets flew and lives hung in the balance, something unexpected was taking root, something fragile and dangerous, like a spark in the dry prairie grass. Romance and revenge were two sides of the same coin, and before this was over, both would burn. Chapter 2. The fire within the saloon was a storm of sound and fury. Gunfire cracked like thunder, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. Annie crouched behind an overturned table, her rifle pressed tight against her shoulder. She fired a shot, the recoil jolting her arm as one of Walker's men crumpled to the floor. Beside her, Maria moved with precision, her revolver spitting fire as she picked off another outlaw who had been foolish enough to step into the open. "Annie, cover me!" Maria shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Annie nodded, popping up from her cover to lay down suppressing fire. Maria darted toward the bar, her boots skidding on the sawdust-covered floor. She slid behind the counter, her back pressed against the wood as bullets splintered the edge above her head. From her new position, she had a clear line of sight to the back of the saloon, where Walker Wiley stood like a shadow in the flickering lamplight. Walker hadn't drawn his gun yet. He stood with an eerie calm, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver as if he were waiting for the perfect moment. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked between Annie and Maria. He was studying them, testing their mettle, and it made Annie's blood boil. "Maria!" Annie called, her voice tight with urgency. "We've got to take him now before—" Before she could finish, Walker moved. He drew his gun in a blur of motion, firing a single shot that shattered the lamp hanging above the bar. The room plunged into near darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. Annie cursed under her breath, her eyes struggling to adjust as shadows danced across the walls. "Stay sharp," Maria said, her voice low but steady. "He's playing with us." Annie's grip tightened on her rifle. She hated the feeling of being hunted, of not knowing where the next attack would come from. But she forced herself to focus, her ears straining to pick up any sound over the chaos. The saloon was a maze of overturned tables and broken chairs, and Walker could be anywhere. Outside, the pounding of hooves signaled the arrival of Elias and the others. The marshal burst through the saloon doors, his revolver drawn and his eyes blazing with determination. Caleb and Doc followed close behind, their weapons at the ready. "Annie! Maria!" Elias called, his voice cutting through the din. "Report! Walker's here!" Maria shouted from behind the bar. "He's got at least 6 men with him, maybe more." Elias nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He spotted Annie crouched near the center of the saloon and motioned for Caleb and Doc to fan out. The 2 men moved with practiced ease, their weapons sweeping the room as they advanced. Walker's voice rang out from the shadows, smooth and mocking. "Well, well, the marshal himself. I was wondering when you'd show up." Elias's jaw tightened, his grip on his revolver steady. "It's over, Walker. Surrender now, and I'll see to it you get a fair trial." Walker laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "A fair trial? You and I both know that's not how this ends, Grey. You've been chasing me for years, and now you've finally got me cornered. But tell me, are you ready to pay the price?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was answer enough. The gunfire resumed, louder and more chaotic than before. Walker's men, emboldened by their leader's defiance, fought with renewed ferocity. Caleb took down one with a well-placed shot, his face grim and unyielding. Doc moved like a ghost, his revolver flashing as he cleared a path toward the back of the saloon. Annie and Maria worked in tandem, their movements fluid and instinctive. Annie provided cover while Maria advanced, her revolver barking with deadly precision. They had fought together enough times to know each other's rhythms, and tonight was no different. But Walker was no ordinary outlaw. He moved through the shadows like a phantom, his shots precise and deliberate. He wasn't just trying to escape, he was testing them, pushing them to their limits. And as the fight dragged on, it became clear that he had no intention of going quietly. Elias finally caught sight of Walker near the back of the saloon. The outlaw was reloading his revolver, his movements calm and unhurried. Elias raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger, but before he could fire, Walker ducked behind a stack of barrels, disappearing from view. "Walker!" Elias shouted, his voice ringing with authority. "Face me man to man, or are you too much of a coward?" For a moment, there was silence. Then Walker's voice came from the shadows, low and taunting. "Careful, Grey. Pride's a dangerous thing. It'll get you killed." Elias didn't respond. He motioned for Caleb and Doc to circle around, cutting off Walker's escape routes. The marshal knew this was their best chance to end it, but he also knew that Walker wouldn't go down without a fight. Meanwhile, Annie and Maria had managed to pin down the last of Walker's men near the bar. The outlaws were running low on ammunition, their shots growing more sporadic. Annie took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she prepared to make her move. "Maria, on my signal," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "We take them together." Maria nodded, her eyes meeting Annie's. There was a flicker of something unspoken between them. Trust, perhaps, or something deeper. But there was no time to dwell on it. Annie gave the signal, and the 2 women moved as one, their guns blazing as they took down the remaining outlaws. The saloon fell silent, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and blood. But the fight wasn't over. Walker was still out there, and they all knew it. Elias stepped forward, his revolver raised as he scanned the room. "Walker!" he called, his voice echoing in the stillness. "It's over. Come out and face me." For a moment, there was no response. Then, from the shadows, Walker's voice came again, low and dangerous. "You think this is over, Grey? This is just the beginning." Before anyone could react, a gunshot rang out, the sound deafening in the quiet saloon. Elias staggered, a red stain blooming on his shoulder as he fell to one knee. Annie's heart leapt into her throat, and she raised her rifle, her eyes searching for the source of the shot. Walker stepped into the light, his revolver smoking. His eyes met Elias's, and for a moment the 2 men stared at each other, locked in a silent battle of wills. "This isn't over," Walker said, his voice cold and final. Then he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving chaos and bloodshed in his wake. Annie rushed to Elias's side, her hands trembling as she pressed a cloth to his wound. "Stay with me, Marshal," she said. her voice thick with emotion. "We're not losing you. Not tonight." Elias gritted his teeth, his face pale but determined. "He's not getting away," he said, his voice a low growl. "Not this time." Outside the town of Redstone was quiet once more, but the storm was far from over. Walker Wiley had escaped, but the battle had only just begun. And as the group regrouped and tended to their wounds, one thing was clear: the fight for Redstone, and for their own survival, was far from finished. Chapter 3. The Hunt Begins. The morning sun rose over Redstone, casting long shadows across the dirt streets. The town was eerily quiet, the aftermath of the saloon shootout still fresh in everyone's minds. Shattered glass and splintered wood littered the ground, and the faint smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. The townsfolk, who had spent the night huddled behind locked doors, began to emerge cautiously, their faces pale and drawn. They whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward the saloon where the lawmen and women had gathered. Inside, Marshal Elias Grey sat at a table, his shoulder hastily bandaged. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it was enough to slow him down. He winced as Maria tightened the bandage, her hands steady despite the tension in the room. "You should rest," Maria said, her voice calm but firm. "You're no good to us if you push yourself too hard." Elias shook his head, his jaw set. "Walker's out there, and he's not going to wait for me to recover. We need to move now, while his trail is still fresh." Annie leaned against the bar, her rifle resting at her side. Her auburn hair was disheveled, and there was a faint bruise on her cheek from the fight the night before. "He's right," she said, her green eyes flashing with determination. "Walker's not the type to sit still. If we don't go after him now, we'll lose him." Caleb Boone, the grizzled tracker, stood near the door, his arms crossed over his chest. "I can find him," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "He's heading south toward the canyons. That's where I'd go if I wanted to disappear." Doc Harlan, who had been cleaning his revolver at a nearby table, looked up. "The canyons are rough country," he said. "Plenty of places to hide, and plenty of ways to ambush anyone foolish enough to follow." Elias nodded, his expression grim. "That's why we need to be smart about this. Walker's expecting us to come after him, and he'll be ready. But we don't have a choice. If we let him go, he'll come back stronger, and more people will die." Maria finished tying off the bandage and stepped back, her brown eyes meeting Elias's. "Then we'll do what we always do," she said. "We'll outthink him." Elias stood, his movements stiff but purposeful. "Caleb, you're on point. Find the trail and lead us to him. Doc, you stay close to me. Annie, Maria, you two take the rear. Watch for any signs of an ambush." Annie raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "You're putting me in the back? Afraid I'll show you up, Marshal?" Elias allowed himself a small smile, despite the weight of the situation. "Just don't shoot me in the back, McGraw." The group gathered their gear and stepped out into the morning light. The townsfolk watched in silence as they mounted their horses, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. Elias tipped his hat to a young boy who stood clutching his mother's hand, then turned his horse toward the south. The hunt for Walker Wiley had begun. The trail was faint but clear enough for Caleb to follow. The tracker moved with the ease of a man who had spent his life reading the land, his sharp eyes scanning the ground for signs of passage. A broken branch here, a scuffed rock there. Each clue told a story, and Caleb read it like a book. "He's moving fast," Caleb said, his voice carrying over the sound of hooves on dry earth. "But he's not being careful. He knows we're coming, and he wants us to follow." "Why would he want that?" Annie asked, her rifle resting across her saddle. "Seems like a bad idea to lead us right to him." "Because he's setting a trap," Maria said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Walker's not running scared. He's leading us into a fight on his terms." Elias nodded, his face grim. "That's why we need to stay sharp. Caleb, how far to the canyons?" "Another hour, maybe less," Caleb replied. "We'll hit the edge of the ridge first. Good place to stop and get a look at the terrain." The group rode in silence after that, the weight of the mission pressing down on them. The land grew rougher as they approached the canyons, the rolling plains giving way to jagged rocks and dry riverbeds. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat relentless, and the scent of sagebrush filled the air. When they reached the ridge, Caleb dismounted and crouched low, his eyes scanning the landscape below. The canyon stretched out before them, a maze of red rock and shadow. It was beautiful in its own way, but it was also treacherous, a perfect place for an ambush. "He's down there," Caleb said, pointing to a narrow trail that wound its way into the canyon. "The tracks lead straight in." Elias dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. We'll go in on foot from here. Horses won't do us much good in that terrain." The group tied their horses to a cluster of scrubby trees and checked their weapons. Annie slung her rifle over her shoulder, her green eyes scanning the canyon with a mixture of excitement and caution. Maria adjusted her holster, her expression unreadable as always. "Stay close," Elias said, his voice low, "and watch each other's backs. Walker's men could be anywhere." They descended into the canyon, the walls rising high on either side of them. The air was cooler here, the shadows deep and shifting. Caleb led the way, his movements silent and deliberate. The others followed, their senses on high alert. As they moved deeper into the canyon, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Annie's fingers itched to grip her rifle, but she forced herself to stay calm. She glanced at Maria, who was walking just ahead of her, and felt a strange sense of reassurance. Maria's calm, steady presence was like a rock in the storm, and Annie found herself drawing strength from it. The sound of a rock falling echoed through the canyon, and the group froze. Elias raised a hand, signaling for silence. They waited, their breaths shallow, but the sound didn't come again. "Could be the wind," Doc whispered, his voice barely audible. "Or it could be them," Caleb replied, his eyes scanning the cliffs above. Elias motioned for them to keep moving, his hand resting on his revolver. They advanced cautiously, every step feeling like it could be their last. Then, without warning, the canyon erupted into chaos. Gunfire rang out from above, the sharp cracks echoing off the canyon walls. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, sending shards of stone flying. The group dove for cover, their weapons drawn as they returned fire. "They're up on the ridge!" Caleb shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. "At least 4 of them!" Annie pressed herself against the canyon wall, her rifle snapping up as she fired at a shadowy figure on the ridge. The man fell, his body tumbling down the rocks, but there were more where he came from. Maria crouched beside her, her revolver steady as she fired at another attacker. "They've got the high ground," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos. "We need to move or they'll pick us off one by one." Elias nodded, his face set with determination. "Caleb, Doc, lay down cover fire. Annie, Maria, follow me. We're taking the fight to them." The group moved as one, their movements coordinated and precise. Bullets flew, and the canyon seemed to close in around them, but they pressed on. They had come too far to turn back now. Walker Wiley was close. They could feel it, and no matter what it took, they were going to bring him down. Chapter 4. A shadow slips away. The canyon was a battlefield. Gunfire echoed off the red rock walls, the sharp cracks reverberating like thunder. Dust and smoke filled the air, and the shouts of men and women were swallowed by the chaos. Marshal Elias Grey and his team fought with everything they had, their movements sharp and deliberate. But Walker Wiley's gang had chosen their ground well. The high ridges gave them the advantage, and for every outlaw they took down, it seemed another appeared to take his place. Annie McGraw crouched behind a boulder, her rifle pressed tight against her shoulder. She fired a shot, the recoil jolting her arm as another of Walker's men fell from the ridge above. Beside her, Maria Vega reloaded her revolver with practiced efficiency, her brown eyes scanning the cliffs for their next target. "They're thinning out," Maria said, her voice calm but edged with urgency. "We're breaking them." "Not fast enough," Annie replied, her green eyes narrowing as she spotted movement on the ridge. She fired again, the shot kicking up a spray of dust as it struck the rock near her target. "Walker's still out there. I can feel it." On the other side of the canyon, Elias and Caleb Boone were pinned down behind a cluster of rocks. Caleb's sharp eyes tracked the outlaws' movements, his rifle barking as he picked them off one by one. Doc Harlan was further back, his revolver flashing as he provided cover fire. "Walker's not here to win," Elias said, his voice low but firm. "He's here to buy time. He's using his men to cover his escape." Caleb nodded, his face grim. "Then we'd better move fast or we'll lose him." Elias motioned for Doc to join them, his sharp eyes scanning the canyon for any sign of their quarry. "Annie, Maria," he called, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We're moving up. Stay close." The group regrouped and began to push forward, their movements coordinated and precise. The outlaws on the ridge were faltering, their shots growing more sporadic as their numbers dwindled. But as they advanced, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Walker Wiley crouched in the shadows of a narrow crevice, his sharp eyes watching the battle unfold below. His gang was losing, just as he had expected. They were good men, loyal, ruthless, but they were no match for Elias Grey and his team. Walker had known that from the start. That was why he had chosen this place, why he had led them here. The canyon was a trap, but not for the lawmen. It was a trap for his own men, a sacrifice to ensure his escape. Walker's lips curled into a faint smile as he adjusted the brim of his hat. He had always been a step ahead, always willing to do what others wouldn't. That was why he was still alive, why he had survived when so many others had fallen. And that was why he would survive today. He slipped out of the crevice and moved quickly, his boots silent on the rocky ground. The canyon walls loomed high around him, their shadows deep and shifting in the midday sun. He knew this land well, knew every twist and turn of the trails that wound through the rocks. He had planned his escape carefully, and now it was time to put that plan into action. Elias reached the top of the ridge, his revolver drawn as he scanned the terrain. The last of Walker's men had fallen, their bodies scattered across the rocks below. The canyon was silent now, the echoes of gunfire fading into the distance. But Walker was nowhere to be seen. "He's gone," Elias said, his voice tight with frustration. "He used his men to cover his tracks." Annie climbed up beside him, her rifle slung over her shoulder. "He can't have gotten far," she said, her green eyes blazing with determination. "We'll find him." Maria joined them, her expression calm but serious. "He's smart," she said. "He wouldn't have come here without a plan. He's probably heading for the border." Elias nodded, his jaw clenched. "Caleb, can you pick up his trail?" The tracker knelt beside a patch of disturbed earth, his sharp eyes studying the faint footprints that led away from the ridge. "He's moving fast," Caleb said, his voice low. "But he's alone now. That'll slow him down." "Then we move," Elias said, his voice firm. "We're not letting him get away." Walker moved like a shadow through the wilderness, his steps quick and deliberate. He had abandoned his horse earlier, knowing it would leave too clear a trail. Now he relied on his own 2 feet, his knowledge of the land, and the small stash of supplies he had hidden near the canyon's edge. By the time the sun began to set, he had reached the edge of the Wyoming plains. The land stretched out before him, vast and empty, the horizon painted in hues of amber and gold. He paused for a moment, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. He had made it this far, but he wasn't safe yet. The lawmen would be on his trail, and they wouldn't stop until they had him in chains, or in the ground. Walker's hand rested on the revolver at his hip, his fingers brushing the worn leather of the holster. He had faced death before, had stared it in the eye and walked away. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for something more, something he couldn't quite name. But that burned in his chest like a fire. He turned his gaze south, toward the border. Mexico was still days away, but it was his best chance. If he could make it across, he could disappear, start over. He had done it before, and he could do it again. With one last glance over his shoulder, Walker set off into the fading light, his silhouette a dark shadow against the endless plains. Behind him, the lawmen were closing in, their determination as unyielding as the land itself. But Walker Wiley was a survivor, and he wasn't ready to give up just yet. Elias and his team reached the edge of the canyon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Caleb knelt beside a set of tracks, his face grim. "He's heading south," he said, "toward the border." Elias nodded, his expression hard. "Then we keep going. We can't let him get away." Annie stepped forward, her green eyes blazing. "We'll catch him, Marshal. He can't run forever." Maria placed a hand on Annie's shoulder, her touch light but steady. "He's smart," she said. "But so are we. We'll find him." Elias looked out over the plains, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Walker was out there, somewhere, and the chase wasn't over. Not yet. "Let's move," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've got a long ride ahead." As the group mounted their horses and rode into the night, the stars began to emerge, their light cold and distant. The hunt for Walker Wiley wasn't over, but for now, the outlaw had slipped through their fingers. And as the darkness closed in around them, one thing was certain: the fight wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Thanks for riding along, partner. If you enjoyed this tale from the wild frontier, give us a like and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Until next time, keep your boots dusty and your aim true.